What do you got?
We were trying to change something.
Skateboarding is a way of learning how to redefine the world around you.
The owners of this country don't care about the poor and your owners.
Now, baby, push me. Push me again now.
Screaming out a wall.
But I really love the juxtaposition of this and that, and you kind of like end up getting to a point where you're bullshitting your way through it. What's up, you miscreants, you misfits, you outcast of society? I am truly honored to have our guest, Victor Atkins, artist extraordinaire, someone that I stumbled upon his videos. I believe it was Instagram. They were made for YouTube, right?
Right. In 19?
Yeah, 2019. And for some reason, they just really popped out for me among the sea of content that we see on Instagram or YouTube. There was something about your demeanor, the way that you were expressing, the way that you felt and how you viewed the artistic expression. And also another thing that, like, for me, like, was a very, like, focal point was you're older, right? And you have this experience, and what we tend to see on Instagram or social media is really perspectives from, to me, like, unwise people, people that haven't had the experience to talk about. And that was something that I gravitated towards. And I think because I feel like there's a disconnect, especially with social media, of what I learned, growing up, is to gain experience from people that have lived it, right? That have gone on these journeys. And I knew just right away from looking at your videos that you were someone that has lived it, and now you were sharing it, and you were sharing it in a way that was, I think, meaningful for people like me. And how did you end up doing those videos? What inspired you to do those videos?
Well, first of all, don't confuse gray hair with wisdom.
Right.
It's just, I tend to be very introspective, so it often can sound like wisdom, but thank you. It was really not my idea. One of the people that I work with wanted to get some of the things that I think about and I'm obsessed about out on the air, to have a broader conversation with a wider age group, and to share some of the life experiences that I've gone through from, my early life to where I am now.
So talking about your early life, I don't know too much about your early life and where you grew up and how you got to the point of getting into art. Can you give me a brief overview of your life?
Sure. I grew up in New York, in the Rockaways near the beach. My early years were nothing to write home about. I was a kid. My interesting part of my life really began when the drug culture hit the beach community in the 60s. And I started to see a lot of people dying from the more toxic drug use, if you will. And I had to make a choice. Do I want to live, or do I want to go down the same route?
How old were you around
I was
this time?
in my early 20s, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. And I kind of liked to draw, and I liked the art world, and I had a lot of friends who went to the School of Visual Arts in New York, and that just seemed like a better alternative than either sticking a needle in my arm or jumping off a building. So, I choose life. I still choose life, but it was really in art school that I really found a passion or a heartthrob that I could identify at that point in my life as who I am and what my purpose might be.
Do you remember the moment when you really started feeling connected to that?
I was almost on day one. I was treated like an entirely different human being. The art world is, especially in the 60s and 70s, was somewhat in the avant-garde mode where everyone was welcome. The freakier the better, the nerdier the better. It didn't matter who you were. It was just if you're willing to be part of, if you're willing to accept this is what's happening, and I've got something to add to it or take from it. And it was a much different atmosphere than a small high school community in the beach. It was very insular there, very expansive. There were, I would say that when I moved to the Lower East Side and started going to art school, that was really the major turning point in my life.
What was the art scene like at that time? What was the energy? What was really going on at that time as far as
exploration? When I started art school, the art school, which is pretty famous now, the School of Visual Arts, was not an accredited school. So it was more or less a party school for artists. And that was just about everything that I needed. At that point in my life, I could continue to do light drugs, continue to smoke a lot of weed and just party and go home and paint. So my life became about a mix of exploring art and exploring social activities and exploring a social community. And it had exploded, but the art scene had exploded, with Warhol and Basquiat and, the Studio 54 thing. And in the beginning, I was in the peripheral of that. As a young art student, there was more of a localized community. But I think in the 70s, I moved to Soho, and that's where I was really immersed in it. Art was everywhere. You could walk across the street, and the best galleries in the world were in the Castelli building, or you can go around the corner, and it was just gallery after gallery after gallery, and great artists after great artists. But also, it was a tight community. There was just literally hundreds of artists everywhere.
Looking back on it, what do you think was really responsible for the art explosion? Because prior to that, right, there wasn't that didn't really exist in the capacity that it ended up being, and then now carried on over into now, and of course being connected to commercialism as well. But when it in the infancy of it, it wasn't that necessarily. But where do you think that came from?
Well, historically, like the abstract expressionism movement that really started in the 1930s, which I wasn't there for, or the 40s or the 50s. But what the artists in the 40s and 50s found out was this really cheap rent for massive spaces. As if you paid $25 a month, that was a lot. Some places were almost free because these landlords didn't know what to do with the space. In the 60s and 70s, people got hip to that, hey, this area, this Soho area, as it was, there were all these industrial buildings that most of the businesses were kind of going out, but they still owned the buildings, so that they were transferred from merchants to landlords. And the artists were quick to find space, and even until I'd say the 80s, it was still very affordable. So I think the need for space and the secondary need for community, or maybe they're both equal, drew people to that kind of space, which doesn't exist anywhere else.
I don't want to necessarily jump ahead too far, but I think it's relatable to
Oh, go ahead and
the
jump,
topic
yeah.
at hand. How do you think that contrast now, where it's firstly, like you would never be able to find a place that was inexpensive or like a starving artist could really exist without really working like on a commercial level. I would imagine back then, like you could just be the suffering artist, but still really maintain that lifestyle in a way that you just couldn't do that now. You'd be living in a tent, right? Like if you were trying to live the same way back then. How do you view that contrast?
Well, yeah, that's true in LA for sure. I mean, if you want to live in Iowa
Yeah.
and be in a very teeny community of maybe you and your family,
Right.
you can maybe live for less than LA. I think it's a given, but I think the problem with being an artist in New York or LA or Chicago, one of the bigger places, is it goes back to money. It goes back to the ridiculous amount of monies people charge for these spaces. The landlords got hip in the same way the artists did, and they started jacking the rents up where it became unaffordable, and socially, and the overall narrative of life in the West is there's really little respect for artists. There isn't an embracing of this art culture as there is in some of the other parts of the world. So it's monetized, and if I can make money from you, fine. And so I think what artists are forced to do, in the same way we're forced in some situations for the 20 and 30-year-olds to find shares. So now we see large spaces cutting up into even like we work spaces, or just somebody will run a big space and make three spaces out of it. So it's very, very different. Unless you're very, very successful, you have to work in the confines of what's available. Something like a 400 square foot space, which is not very big for a painter, in a place like Vernon, which is on the edge of the art district, is $2 and $3 a square foot.
Touching into South Central. You're talking about Vernon.
Yeah. So you can go further into dark territories, but it depends on who you are and how you get along with those situations. Back in the day, it was not a problem because it was just industry. Now you're invading people's areas, so people are looking for cheap spaces, and in a way, it's gentrifying. Although it's for the creative, gentrifying is gentrifying, and the people of the neighborhood are not particularly enamored with that. So if you're the kind of person who can sneak your way in and keep your head low and get along with your neighbors, you'll do well, but it's still pretty pricey.
I was just going to suggest that now I think it's less about the idea of the community versus, what we have now is more of a self-indulgent, gratifying or just self-motivated for the individual versus like a community sense. It doesn't really matter where someone ends up or what they're doing. It's that, to me, that connection has like lost. But I think that really translates over into a lot of things as time has moved on. We have less and less sense of community and what that means in all areas of life.
Yeah, but yes and no. We're finding in this last year, as the dream is to come out of this pandemic, that there's a desperate hunger amongst the art community to come together as a community. We get, being in LA here, that there's basically 80 little LAs, and they're just divided by little areas, and every area has a different type of art community. And they're somewhat defined by the tributaries that run in and out of LA. What happens in East LA will not be the same that happens in Pasadena or in West Philly. I'm sorry, Philadelphia.
And
Sorry.
going back to Philly.
We went back to Philly. Just a little mind fart. Sorry. In West Hollywood.
Yeah.
So we're finding, just as we go to some events, especially now that we've moved into the film world, we're finding that there's a real need for community. It's just more work than if you have 20 people who are your neighbors.
Oh, big time. So jumping back, we went forward a little bit. Let's go back to, I want to talk more about how you got into painting itself. So when you first went to art school, you didn't necessarily have that passion for painting, or was it something that was on your radar?
It was on my radar. It was just a foreign language because, before that it was a pencil and a pad. But
and did you have any idea of the history of painting or like current painters?
I learned as I dived in. I'm a pretty passionate person, so if I'm going to do something, I'm going to dive in. So again, being in New York at that time, there was so many great museums, so many great galleries, so many artists that you can get in their studios and hang out with, so many people to give you somewhat of a mentorship kind of situation, but at the same hand, people were very often private about their work. There was having so many artists in that area, when it comes to seeing and sharing work, there was a little air of paranoia, people concerned about their ideas being ripped off,
Yeah.
So it was an interesting mix, I don't want to paint it as like art heaven, it was like with all the problems that come with life, but it was just unique because there's so many creatives in all the fields. It wasn't just painters, it was filmmakers, it was sculptors, it was photographers, tons of great photographers, great filmmakers, actors, dancers. I mean, it was really quite an interesting mix. The performing garage was there. Improvisational theater, just everything was there, and you would often see like John Lennon walking around, or I believe Jimi Hendrix had a studio across the street from a friend of mine. So it drew everybody, it was kind of the place to be and the place where art was happening.
So when did you get to the point, so when you first started like painting, when you got there, what was the point where you're like, this is it, this is really what I want to do? Like when you first saw your work that, okay, there's a lot of potential here.
Oh, when galleries, even before I left art school, said, yeah, we'll show you, and then people bought stuff,
How was that, like, what was that process like?
It was kind of easier then because there isn't the same competition, for the lack of a better word, over time it got to be intense, but like in the 60s, there were lots of new galleries that were trying to break in and kind of get a piece of the action. It would be relatively impossible to get into a gallery like Castelli or Emmerich. You have to already have a name, but there were a lot of secondary galleries that opened. So for a young artist, you can find your way into a gallery, and once stuff starts to sell, you feel like you have value. So it's easy to get hooked, and that combined with just a radical community where there's
energy must have been so amazing.
Amazing, and
Yeah.
it was a nightlife. I'd get up at 11 and paint for till maybe 10 or 11 at night, and then we would go out and do a round of 5 or 6 bars and just come home and crash and get up and go paint again. I mean, that was kind of the circuit of my life.
What was the first painting that you sold, and do you remember?
Oh, I don't remember. No,
Yeah.
I've sold so many, I don't remember.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just like curious as to how much it like sold for, and then how much you could live off that like around that time.
Well, the thing I do remember is like in 1969, I decided it'd be fun to do some record covers. So I took some small canvases and just did a bunch of paintings, and I walked into Columbia Records and I asked to see the art director, and
Just strolled up in there.
I just walked right in, and they let me in, and I said, I'd like to do some record albums. And he looked at the paintings he had. These are cool. Let me see if I got something for you. And I don't know, a week later he called and said, are you interested in doing a Miles Davis cover?
What?
Yeah, and so I said, sure.
You're like, let me think about it.
So I did the Miles Davis cover, and that was $600. Just straight out, and for young artists, that was a lot of money.
Right,
back then.
yeah.
So, and I did very little changes to the original art. You know, I think there was one color in there that Miles didn't like and asked me to change, and he really loved it, and I was happy, and I thought, okay, I got a gig here. So the next thing they called me about was, hey, do you want to do a Bee Gees thing? And I said, oh, well, yeah, they're pretty popular. You know, maybe there's something to this, this album stuff. And
So I'm really interested in the Miles Davis cover before we go any further. What's Miles Davis album
there's
cover?
Miles in the Sky.
Wow.
So there's actually an internet, Instagram group just for that album. So there's something like 600 people on this group. It's just pretty
Just for that
outstanding.
album. Yeah.
And I've got so much attention over, mostly here in LA, about that cover. So it's been a trip.
Wow. How did that make you feel being a young artist to be able or be connected to that name? And were you a fan of Miles Davis before that?
Yeah, it was. And it was just like $600. What's next?
Yeah. I
you
would have sat in that feeling for quite some time if that was me, but
I just was about work. I've always been like worker bee. I get somewhat googly-eyed and fan love, but not overwhelming. I was invited to sit with, and let me back up. I knew this really well-known French photographer, and he was friends with Abbie Hoffman and Paul Rubin, which were the extreme radicals of the day. And they were going to have a sit-down with John Lennon. And so Jacques said, you want to come? And I went, no, not really. I mean, what the hell am I going to add to that conversation?
Yeah, right. Okay.
I'm not a radical. I probably believe in a lot of the shit that they're talking about, but that's not my thing. I'm an artist. That's what I do. That's where I found my passion. That's where I found my heartbeat. And so there's plenty of times where, we sat down with famous people, somebody having lunch at a corner cafe. This one instance was this guy David that I knew was sitting with Lauren Bacall, and said, hey, come sit down and have some lunch with us. So that was kind of a regular thing. You just, they're people, man, and they all piss the same way. So it didn't really go, oh yeah, I've got to be John Lennon's buddy, or I got to kind of hang out with that person. If that happened organically, it was like, yay, but it wasn't a drive.
Yeah, there's only like two people that I'd probably nerd out on. I don't know so much anymore. It was Woody Allen before, but I don't know about that now.
Yeah.
And Larry David. If I saw him, I'd probably geek out a little bit. But I, having the experience of being involved in the skateboarding world, I learned that early on, especially living in LA. You'd see pro skaters like all the time, and then when I owned my skate shop, I was meeting people that I was like. Is it tight?
Yeah, it's just like pressing on my glasses.
That's what happens to me too. Like right now, the pressure is just like here. But I use these when I do my editing. But you can probably take them off and because you don't need them to.
If I
you
can
could
take them off, that'd be
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
what it does is it digs the ends of these things.
Oh no, I know.
Yeah.
I feel it.
So
I just it's good for me to be able to. It's I can hear without any worries about what you're saying or anything like that. So I'll just go headphones. You go headphoneless.
Oh, that's fun.
Would be good.
Yeah.
I like the contrast.
Yeah.
But yeah, what I was saying about like skateboarding is that when I owned my skate shop, I started meeting like legends, like these guys that I grew up with in the 80s and 90s. And even prior to that, just like I said, living in LA, it's a lot different, right, than a kid that lives in the Midwest that's so disconnected from that. They look up to these skaters as like gods and like sort of inhuman, like there's something else. But I learned from an early stage that they're just people. And so that really started like carrying over into like everything and how I went about it. I'd like to get back to your approach. Ian MacKay of Minor Threat did an interview, and they asked him about, if he followed how many record sales they got or anything like that. And he just he kind of shook his head and said, no, I just do the work. I just do the work, and I'm not really worried about what the outcome is. If I'm just focused on doing the work, and that's the process that actually makes me happy, it's not worrying about other things. I'd actually learned that and I'm still learning that. But I really like that mentality because I think you're able to be a lot more consistent with your work if you're not always worrying about what's going to happen with the work after. You're just you're in the moment with your work. Is that something that developed for you, or that was just innate?
I was just thinking the best way to answer that. The work itself has a heartbeat. If we're connected to the idea of being a maker, we have a heartbeat that connects us to make something. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Where we live and where we work, we begin to have a conversation with, and so the exploration for me is to be concerned, not to worry, to be concerned about craft, to be concerned about storytelling, to be concerned about putting forth a positive message into a pretty dark world. So my obsession is more of being a good storyteller, to find ways to improve who I am as a person, what drives me as a person, what drives me to do this work. I think for the last 15 years, it's impossible for me to do anything that there isn't something bigger than myself driving this work. So if there's something bigger than myself driving this work, there's really nothing to worry about. So I look at the idea of being a maker as a gift. So what's cool is oftentimes people give us a gift, like a shirt or a gift card to some goofy restaurant, and maybe for the restaurant we'll use it once, or the most times it will sit in the drawer and the gift goes unused. But a shirt, it's kind of usually something you'd never wear, and it sits in the closet and it has no use. But when we give these kind of heavenly gifts, if you were, whatever you believe in, when you're gifted with the joy of making, it no longer becomes a pressure, it becomes an involvement. And so we learn to honor the gift and make well thought out, well invested use of that gift, not to take it granted. And so the work becomes about honoring a gift, not being a worker.
It's so interesting to me that you bring that up, because just recently, something that I created for somebody else, and it was done in a different way than what I guess I usually create, because it came from more of a place of love, because I've like had these deeper connections and deeper understandings with this person. So when I was creating, I I didn't think about what the outcome was. I just was so invested with whatever the feeling that I had inside, and then it came out. But the fact that for me, I put my energy into that and this creativity, and then the person's response or what they got out of it was tenfold than me sending a card, or you know what I mean, with some writing that somebody else or something else that somebody created. But that really I was able to tap into something else, and sometimes I do that, and then when I'm shooting photos with my daughter, for example, I usually will create, like for me, like really beautiful pictures, and it doesn't really matter what the response is or whatever it is. But then I've noticed that people gravitate towards I know when I was in that moment of taking the photo, it was pure connection to whatever the subject or whatever it was that I was taking a picture of. And I know when it's been more maybe contrived or thought about, and not as connected. It's not conveyed in that way of coming from a place of just pureness or love or whatever. But yeah, when you talk about that source, did you have that as a younger artist?
No.
You said the last 15 years that it really started hitting differently.
It was there. It was like an itch. It's an itch, and you can't get at it. You don't know what it's about. Too abstract.
Yes.
Somewhat annoying, but it's there.
Yeah, I know.
It's been really in the last 15, 20 years that that kind of ache to explore the mysticism of life began to become recognizable, to be almost something that I could actually grasp, or at the very least explore. And it was just a great freedom and a great agony, because we have to forget a lot of, I can't talk for you. I mean, I have to forget a lot of old thinking. I have to just start working on making new neural pathways. The old ones just don't. They're invested in making my life like shit, and so I'm finding things that are bringing me joy. And I want to go back to what you said. Like love is the universal language. All hearts gravitate towards love. When we make from a place of love, when we make from a place of a connection of greater than ourselves. As a photographer, when you photograph another person, if you see that person through the eyes of love, one thing's going to happen. If you see them just through the eyes of a good technician, another thing's going to happen. And the viewer will know that intuitively. So when you the pictures I've seen of your daughter, they have an inner life in them that wouldn't be there if you're just trying to capture moments. What you're doing is you capture moments through that lens of love. And, I believe that's what makes storytelling special.
So for myself, that wasn't always the case of wanting to create or do things from that place. I always, especially with writing, because I would write a lot of poetry as well, and I always felt that I had to suffer in order to create. But that was part of what you're talking about, is like this old way of thinking for myself, because I grew up around so much dysfunction and suffering that place felt really comfortable for me. So I felt like because I wanted to express so much when I was younger, and photography for me was something at a very young age that I gravitated towards, that I had a love for. But I didn't know how to navigate through that because I just didn't have the tools and I didn't really have the guidance to really focus on that. But yeah, so like when I got older, and especially when I was incarcerated, I tapped into writing a lot, but it always came from a place of suffering, and it hasn't been until recently, well, even with the birth of my daughter, of like wanting to express it in a different way, but more so, I think now in the last few months for myself, it's coming from such a different place, and I feel like I've tapped into something that maybe that is what you're talking about.
Yeah, I hope so. You know, I mean, it's a great place to be. It's you know, all hearts generate towards love. It's really that simple, and when we can touch that, we come near that, you know, something special will happen.
So what do you think going back to the question, what were you creating prior to that? Were you just, where do you think that your creation was coming from, or that expression of how does it differ than what you're experiencing now?
Well, I think certainly from passion. You know, the thing about makers is depending on your medium. You know, I get inspiration through my eyes. You know, so seeing things we want to make stories. The difference is when we make on our own energy, we're always reliant on ourselves. So if I'm constantly working to work, if I'm working to make art, if I'm working to make art for money, and it's all coming from my own energy, sooner or later I'm going to burn out. You know, sooner or later, people can demand things from me that I will bow down to, because I'm in it for that approval. I'm in it for that success. But in my life, you know, everything I do is I conspire with God. And what does that mean? Conspiring with God. It actually means to breathe with God is the actual translation. So I feel like, you know, in Scripture, it talks about God being our co-laborer, our co-partner. So that's a radical thing for me, the idea that I can sit down in my studio with God and ask for advice and ask, like, just as you were sitting here with me, and I would ask you, well, what do you think about this? And to have ears to actually hear, and a voice to actually have a conversation, and not be reliant just on self, but be reliant on a conversation with a greater power. So for me, that just makes me hungry for more of the conversation, for more ways to tell story, to you know, again, these days, for now anyway, to move outside of making paintings to making film. But I want to talk to you about suffering for a minute. You know, it's the same thing with suffering. If you write about suffering from a suffering place, you get one sound. But if you write from suffering from a place of finding even the joy that came out of your suffering. So if you find a place of peace in your life, we should never avoid our suffering, because it what brings us to the place of peace. So then we can really tell our story from a dynamic, powerful point of view. When we have stories about suffering, I don't want to invalidate them at all, say that's not such. You should just write, you should just paint, you should just do it, you know. But what I'm suggesting is you should find something bigger than yourself and a bigger reason to do it. But whatever your life story is, don't ignore it. Just find a way to tell it with that love language.
So it's interesting. I had a conversation with my mom right before coming over. And I had actually come to that realization and expressed it to her because for like a really long period of time, I blamed circumstances. I blamed the way that I grew up for me going through so much suffering. And she was talking about how I'm always involved in something. I have a lot of different things going on, always, and I love it. For me, it's how for me, it's how I should be living my life. Not really necessarily identifying with one thing that limits me to that one thing. Like I want to experience everything. And I came to the understanding in that moment, though, and I had never thought about it. It was because of the way that I grew up in that dysfunction, not knowing, or ending up in places, right? Like, because we couldn't afford to live, we had to go move over here. If we didn't have enough money for food, we had to go like dig in trash cans for recycles. I mean, the list is endless.
Sure.
But in that moment, I really realized that experience is why I am okay with going out into situations, going out and encountering things, people, events, everything without fear, or to understand that you get past it. No matter what situation you're put in, you're okay, and there can be really beautiful things that can come out of it. But I never had that understanding until today.
No, it's awesome.
It's interesting that you brought that up.
Yeah, because here's the deal. That's what you went through, but the bigger deal is there's a whole bunch of other people going through it right now, and if we tell our story, well, this is what I did, this is what happened, this is what I did, and here I am. We don't offer any hope. And clearly you've made it to the other side of that. You may not be fully where you dream you might be right now, but you're on the path. You're on the road where you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to go into a situation where you're imprisoned. There's all kinds of imprisonment. We can be socially imprisoned. We could be artistically imprisoned, or we can commit crimes and actually be incarcerated. But that should happen. So the question as a storyteller, what do you do with it? As a human, what do I do with it? How do I live my life? And how do I use what happened, regardless of what age you are? If you're 16 or if you're 90, you got a few hours left. How do I live those hours with hope? How do I live those hours with joy? How do I live those hours with family and not with bitterness, not with anger? And so there's something about recognizing our suffering is important, and recognizing that there's something bigger than that will get us through. And storytelling is one of the best ways to get that out.
So when you were going through your journey as being an artist, where did you feel that you felt the strongest about as far as storytelling? And then how were you able to really convey that? You can see on the other side of Victor's head his pretty recent painting, right? This is something that you, and this is kind of, I make that connection to you, like that is, it's Victor. When did you start doing that style of painting, and where did it come from for you?
The idea of something being more important than the other, I think it's more about transition, and I mentioned earlier that we're affected by environment as well as the whole complement of other things. And these paintings really had its genesis in just before the Miles Davis cover. You know, the Miles Davis cover was done in this style, and I continued doing this style for some years. And to pick up on my own thought about being a self-motivated artist where it's just me, I got to the point where I just felt, I'm being redundant. I'm not really offering anything as an artist. It's just the same damn story over and over. I was selling a lot of paintings and privately, and I just felt like I was making wallpaper for people. And so I stopped. I stopped. And
What year was this? Or how old were you?
I was about 40, and I just stopped and I began to explore film. I was always fascinated with film in art school. It just seemed like some of my friends who were in the film school section conversation was just amazing. The collaboration, the amount of thinking that went in.
Collaboration's a big part of it, right? You have to deal with other people.
I just, I was pretty stoned in those days, but so the language was like Charlie Brown language, when they started talking about the more technical stuff of filmmaking. But I got a little bit older and I got a little bit more deep into the piece of being a storyteller and wanting to make story. I began taking acting classes, directing classes, screenwriting classes. I was right in the heart of, the NYU world. So most people can't afford NYU. So I did like New Schools, the extension, and did quite a few classes. And, really fell in love with filmmaking in the same way that I fell in love with being a painter, but I just felt a greater affinity to filmmaking because of the moving aspect of it. I always felt like a show in the gallery was a mini movie, and each painting would be like a very short scene from the short film, and that collectively the viewer would have witnessed a short movie, and it was very limiting. It was very limiting, and so I wrote a screenplay. It was very, very well received in the independent world. It got really close to being actually made as a film, but I got in an argument with a casting director that I hired about whether or not one of the characters should have subtitles or not, and I was a young radical and said no subtitles, and she lied to William Morris about us having enough funding, and William Morris killed the film. And so that was an interesting time for me because I got really bitter about filmmaking. So I went for about 15 years to about 55, even 60, of being involved with cycling and the bicycle racing world.
Really?
Yeah,
I did not
just
know this
dropped
about you.
anything to do with art.
Wow.
I was just so burnt out from painting and the cutthroat world and the cutthroat world of movie making that I entered a different cutthroat world of competitive cycling. And, also opened a high-end bicycle shop.
Wow.
But all that was my suffering that led me to a better place. So and so living here in LA, having been fairly successful about showing this work, but not so much about selling because of the whole pandemic thing. Actually, just ironically, we moved here from the East Coast 4 years ago, closer to 5 now, and all the paintings that I've sold, except for one recently, have been back to the East Coast. So It's just irony, but I'm happy. I'm happy people have them. They're in good homes, and we made a little bit of money from them. But just in the pandemic and in the lack of access to galleries, and so many galleries closing, and so many that were left open, it became more competitive and more difficult. And the few galleries that I had group shows with, they didn't know where they stand, and they started doing virtual shows, which really was a big bomb. And so I picked up that screenplay from 1990, and I rewrote it. And now we're in the process of developing it as a feature again, and doing it independently, and raising money privately. And
So what brought you back to that, to wanting to do that again? Pick it up after all those years?
I don't know. I just felt intuitively I'm supposed to do this. I don't want to freak your viewers out, but I often hear from God whispering in my ear, and I feel like he asked me to pick it up, that it's a valuable story. And, I have a time of quiet where I felt like my LA story for the paintings had reached a real... I'm back to, well, if I continue, I'm going to be making wallpaper. I
Back to the same place you were in before.
Well, it wasn't until the last painting I made was just in this black series. I really loved it, and I felt that I hit the pinnacle of what my LA story was. And the spiritual question for me is, as a maker, is there more to this story? Or am I going to be repeating myself? Am I going to start making wallpaper again? And it's not like I felt like I need to stop. It's more like I have to take a break. I have to go away from it and see, is this my continuing story? To have more to say, to have more to explore, to have a different way to tell this story. And so it's on pause. I don't want to say that I've stopped painting, but I have a drive to create. It's how God's made me to be a creator, and to create with Him. And writing, I love to write, but I more love the idea of movies, and I've always been a big fan of movies. And the idea of making movies again is just enthralling to me.
Well, it's kind of hard to do wallpaper with movies. I mean, unless you're making a film a year since the 70s, like Woody Allen, where you start to see the same sort of characters.
Yeah, with Woody, it's that same kind of,
But he's been doing it for so long, and he does, he's been doing one a year.
But it's the same story, really.
Well, yeah,
it's about about classism.
Classism and moralism, like what's moral and what's not.
What's moral and what certain social, economical structures can get away with.
Yeah, exactly.
And what some can't.
Yeah.
And, okay, got it.
Yeah.
So
well, I think until he hit maybe the 90s, and then he did Blue Jasmine, and that was like one of the last ones that I really dug. But yeah, it's like I said, they're doing a lot, and they're doing it like over and over. Where versus like a painting, it's like like a series, and then it's like there's a lot more, I guess, room to explore, right?
Yeah.
Like with filmmaking than there is.
And you're not always linked into having to write your own screenplay. There's so many talented people who have a good story, and that you can bring a director's eye to it. It's just a fun playground that painting was and will continue to be. But I think it's wise to know when you need to take a pause. That you don't need to continue just to continue.
Right.
And sometimes that's not true. Sometimes you need to continue just to continue. You have to find your own rhythm. There's no rules.
Right.
My life is not your rule. My life is just an example of how I stay alive, and I stay functioning, and I stay thriving, and I stay vital. These are the things that get me by. But filmmaking, I can next, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, you're coming along. We're going to do a short film, and it's for very little money, and it will be wonderful fun. And so there is access. You know, it's. I don't need anything after that. I have YouTube. I have Instagram. I have Snapchat and all the other avenues to put my product out there. What happens to it is the same reality of what happens with my paintings. I don't know.
Right.
You know,
That's not the point.
You know, a famous filmmaker. I heard somebody ask him, "What's your shot list? What's your plan for tomorrow?" And he said, "Well, I have none." And well, how can you have no plan? He says, "Well, you know, listen, I can plan for tomorrow, and when I get there, tomorrow might have a different plan." You know, and you know, I mean, do you know what's going to happen tomorrow? So that's kind of way out there on the limb, but that was his style. But there's something in that, in the sense of make a plan but be adventurous. You know,
I like that a lot.
You know, make a plan but be adventurous, and you know, do things that stretch you, do things that scare you, do things that you don't care if you fall down, because if you fall down, you get up, it'll be a little better next time.
Yeah, I just think of filmmakers like Cassavetes or Werner Herzog or Harmony Korine. For me, those are filmmakers that really explore what filmmaking can be, because when you are so strict that you're not allowing yourself to be open to, you know, if we're on this schedule, that's it, that's all we're going to do. You don't really leave a whole lot of opportunity to be able to explore that medium.
Yeah, sure. Well, with John Cassavetes, his first film had no script. They improvised the whole thing. John was about the moment. He wanted you to believe that this moment was real. Werner loved the simplicity of filmmaking. He hated the idea of all these inserts that we see now. You know, these extra close-ups and, you know, these over-the-head drone shots. You know, he just thought, unless it's absolutely necessary, for the most part, filmmakers do it because they can, which makes no reason at all, rhyme or reason. And so, you know, you study these filmmakers, and you know, you study Marty Scorsese, and the camera becomes an object. You know, it becomes a character. You know, it becomes part of his filmmaking, and how could it not? And so when you kind of look at the broad stroke of the different ways that the great filmmakers approach making film, it gives you inspiration to just use your voice. You know, that there's no one good way or one wrong way to make film. You can say the wrong way is being unprepared, but Cassavetes was a pioneer, you know. So you can't argue with it, but you know, you take somebody like Cameron and
you said James Cameron?
Yeah.
That's the exact person that I was thinking of.
You know, the immense detailing he did with Alien and with the Terminator, you know, and he was a great artist as well, so he would do all his storyboarding, but the storyboarding was like the movie. It was like, I thought this dude hired a professional artist, but no, he'd draw everything, and it was just incredible amount of detailing. So does it make him a better filmmaker than Cassavetes? I don't know. You know,
two different things, right? Two different.
You've got to have vision. You've got to have, this is my story. This is how I want to tell it. These are the people I'm going to work with. With a collaboration comes in, and I'm going to find the love language here. Everybody here loves film, or else they wouldn't be doing it. So I'm going to find what's the unifying thing, and it's the story. And so then we go back to what's driving the story. So if I have another story about shit blowing up and people getting shot, all right, so I'm going to entertain folks, and if I make a good shoot 'em up movie, and the movie might make some money, but so what? So what? Yes, we should be entertained. Yes, we should have some fun. But we're also spiritual people. We're also mystical people. We're also curious people. And we're also people who live in a time where hope is a dirty word. And I think there's a responsibility that we have as humans is to approach each other from a hopeful, kind place, not from a what are you up to, dude? What are you trying to run on me? To be wise, but to be kind. And if we can do that as people, I don't want to paint the creatives as special, but I think what's special about the creatives is that they have to be drawn to the mystic, and the mystic has to live in the eternal, and the eternal has to live in some form of Godhead, regardless of who that is for you. And I'm not here to tell anybody that you're right or you're wrong. It's between you and what you believe in, and you have to find your own peace. You have to find your own solace, and you have to find the strength and the courage to tell your story, whether it's to your family or whether it's to the broad community of culture. So it becomes a choice. Am I going to be responsible for the story, or am I going to be a person who gives you one honest moment? If I can give you one honest moment where you can relate to that and you can walk away with the thought that, hey, there's another side to my own personal story by what I see. Man, what else can we do as humans? But
maybe most people don't look at themselves as artists, because I just look at, I think we all are on a certain capacity, right? Like you're talking about family. You create a family, right? I think
that's the point. Let's debunk the artist thing there.
Yeah.
We're all creatives. Mm-hmm. We're all creatives. We all do things in a way that we can do them, which is not the same as anybody else does. And we get through life by being creative.
And that's what actually connects us as one. And I had this thought a couple of weeks ago where it became apparent to me, just thinking about the universe itself and the concept of the universe coming from a single point, whether we don't really know beyond that single point what it is, and we can call it God. But in that moment, everything after that was created. It was created from this source. And we think about like concepts of, ideas, like where they come from. It's just this moment that happens, and then it expands on that moment. It expands, and what happens after that, the gases and the material and all these things are coming together, and then we see a place like Earth, right, with water and beautiful mountains. And one thing that I really have been connected to and understanding is that most people are not living in an awe. Most people are just watching that blockbuster movie. They're just watching to get it's just like this visceral, just you tell me what I should be excited about, as opposed to just
the need to
living.
be numb.
Right,
It's
yeah.
the need to just shut up and turn, just turn the noise off,
But
and
there's-
put some other noise
Yeah,
on.
but there's no awe of just living and what we are actually experiencing. And I think being detached from a spiritual understanding or sense is repressing that internal creativity that we all do have.
Well, we don't have a language for it. I think there's this incredible harmony of life. That it's the things that you were just talking about. There's a harmonic unity of how things flow, and that it's just, I think, forgive me if you feel different, but I think it's just fucking stupid to think that a bunch of things blowing up into space someplace made the beauty of an infant if we look at a child and every little thing works, and then we grow up as an adult and we can do what we're doing. You know, people invented this shit. It's all harmonic. It all comes together. And to think that it started from an abstract amoeba, you know, it's just stupid shit. You know, there's an intelligence behind all of this. There's an intelligence on how things work. There's a unity. Just the way the mind and the body, if we look at the innards of the body, you know, there's a great series on Netflix called Human, and it explores the brain and the intricacy of the brain, and it goes through the rest of the body. And if you can't see a God in that, if you can't see a harmony in that, you know, this is my opinion. And if I'm pissing you off, I'm pissing you off. We need to look harder. You know, it's too abstract. And if you listen to like C.S. Lewis and the people in the C.S. Lewis Foundation and the scientists who talk about literally the fractions of an inch that the universe can shift on its axis that it would implode. It's that finite. And we're too worried about our rent, you know, and about being pissed off at our neighbor.
Yeah.
And about being heartbroken because we broke up with our lady, or our lady broke up with her guy, or, you know, somebody called you fat, or whatever the hell's going on, to stop and see the harmony and that awe that you're talking about. Because life is filled with awe. And you can see it in the city streets. You can see it in tent city. You can find things to just see the awe of things greater than ourselves. But we were just in the desert. We just went up to Joshua Tree to scout this locations for this film, and it's mind blowing. This bizarre creation in these wacky trees that look like strange alien sculptures, you know, and to get there at 4:00 in the morning and see the blue light and then see the sunrise, it's just wow. And to take that moment and infuse it into how we see the world, that's a challenge for everybody. That's something that has to pay off. It can't have a bad result, you know. So I encourage people, whatever's around you, whether it's your mom or your girlfriend or your wife or your baby, find the awe and the harmony in it, and I guarantee you your life will change.
See, I gotta start acting like we just Yes, Victor. That was absolutely fucking beautiful. I couldn't have articulated it any better. I mean, but that's the truth. I those are my exact feelings and thoughts right now. But that didn't. It didn't just happen. Like, I had to create that, right? Yeah. Like, just as much as you've had to gone through those experiences of suffering in order to create a new outlook on everything. And like I said, like, things have been happening for me in a way recently that just touches on everything that you're talking about, and it's congruent to and in alignment to how I see the world. And when you start opening up yourself to the universe, and if you want to call it God or Jesus or Buddha or Allah, whatever it is, which I think it's all centered around the same understanding and truth. But when you really start to open yourself up to that, that's where the awe comes into play. Yeah. And you see the dance for what it is, and it's really beautiful. We're going to wrap up because I know that you have to take off, and I really appreciate your time.
Sure, my joy. Thank you.
This is, this is what our conversations usually are about, and so it's been very natural. It's been very, it's been beautiful to participate in, and I just want to say thank you again.
Oh, you're welcome. But just one last thought that I think is really important. It's just, if you're listening and you're having a real hard time, in no way am I belittling your pain. I just want to encourage you that there's another side to your story, even in the pain. So, I mean, if you're like that in that moment, like Casper was talking about, where there's no food, here he is, and there's food. You know, you gotta keep walking. You gotta keep walking, but in no way, please belittle your pain.
Right. Thank you, Victor. Would you like to go ahead and give our listeners and our viewer like your Instagram handle or where they can find your work?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. It's Victor B like boy Atkins art. Or you can find me also on Instagram at Isaac_movie. So that's bottom dash.
And that's the project that you're working on right now.
That's the project I'm working now.
Great.
I've been radio silent on Instagram, but there'll be more stuff coming up in these next few months.
Okay, I look forward to it as much as I've looked forward to all your previous stuff that you posted. I really appreciate it, Victor, and obviously I'm really terrible at doing the wrap up on these things because I don't know how to.
You know, we just keep talking for another 3 hours. But thank you for inviting me. Thank you for I look forward giving me an opportunity to share some of the nonsense that runs around my head. But
I'm sure that there's people out there that there's going to be one person that just absolutely appreciates and you know, it could shift someone's life like to hear something at a certain time. So it's definitely appreciated. And thank you for watching. Make sure you don't have to. You could subscribe to the channel. We just reached a milestone as far as
just
subscribers
hit the
go.
button, subscribe.
Yeah, that's all you have to do is just click it. It's pretty
No
damn
big deal
easy
out of your life.
to do. Yeah, thank you for everybody that's listening on all the audio streaming platforms as well. And you guys stay free. Thank you. Peace.
What are you rebelling against?
What do you got?
We were trying to change something.
Skateboarding is a way of learning how to redefine the world around you.
The owners of this country don't care about the poor and your